All right. All right. So good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you to another edition of a very exciting session on data dialogues. And as many of you uh, will appreciate the fact that of late, AI is reshaping the economies. There is a lot of reordering of the geopolitical powers, and essentially the fundamental, democratic discourse is getting changed. Yet, we find that the governance frameworks remain stubbornly reactive and fractured along national lines. Now, this particular session will confront these frontier challenges that the policymakers can no longer defer. The contest over AI sovereignty and who controls these critical digital infrastructures, the systemic ethical risks posed by these models, right? We keep on hearing these almost on a regular basis. The latest being the new model from Anthropic, the Mythos one. Now, from accountability gaps to concentration of power and technology's deepening impact on body politic, from elections and institutions to the very quality of public reasoning, these are some of the things which are to be which should be governed, right? So to address some of these very pertinent issues, we have a session called Governing the Ungovernable, the Frontier Risks, Fractured Responses, and the Future of Tech Policy, with a very esteemed guest which we have with us tonight. And I'm very glad to introduce all of you to Vivek Agarwal, who is today's guest for this session. So Vivek is the country director India for the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. As you know, it is one of the premier think tank and policy tanks across the globe. And just let me introduce all of you to Vivek a bit. So Vivek is a global leader with a deep and wealth of experience in technology and human and economic development. He has led a lot of strategic partnerships across public, private, and social sectors. He regularly engages with the senior leaders across governments, businesses, and non-profits, and advises heads of state on development policy, effective delivery, and strategic communications. With a focus on impact, Vivek has managed large-scale and complex strategic programs in diverse regions, including the Americas, the South Asia, Middle East, and East Africa. As I mentioned earlier, Vivek currently heads the India practice for the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, TBI in short. He advises several cabinet ministers and chief ministers of the country on development reforms, helping leaders prioritize, plan, and deliver on policies. He often speaks at and writes for international and national forums of importance. Some of the notable mentions include World Bank, the Vibrant Gujarat Summit, the India Global Forum, etc. He frequently writes to some of the leading newspapers of the country, like the Indian Express, the Economic Times, the Hindu Business Line, ET Government, Deccan Herald, and the Print. Uh, so Vivek holds a master's in public policy from Georgetown University and a master's and a bachelor's in civil engineering from India's top and prestigious engineering school, which is IIT Kanpur. We all are aware of that. He worked with Nobel Prize winning economist George Akerlof towards his graduate thesis and served as a student president and was conferred the coveted Institute Leadership Award. In his free time, he enjoys, directing theater plays. He has interest in philosophy, and Vivek's extensive leadership experience and global experience and perspective makes him an invaluable asset in organization and innovation. We are very glad to have you, Vivek, here. And please go ahead. The structure is you can, take the session for close to like 40-45 minutes with your deck, and then we'll move into a Q&A session. Yeah, over to you, Vivek. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, JD. That was a very generous introduction, but I'm very, very grateful to you. Also, thank you for setting up the topic of discussion so very well. I think a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is essentially a provocation that my boss, Mr. Tony Blair, had come up with several years ago, which is really that technology is a revolution. There's little to no doubt about that. But where is the response in governance to that revolution, right? So how have governments molded themselves, changed themselves to respond to that revolution? The answer seems to be missing right now. So a lot of what I will talk about comes from that provocation that Mr. Blair set out about 12 years ago, when technology was probably not talked about in the same terms as it is today. Um, and just before I sort of dive in, right, I wanted to share a few thoughts on how we've sort of structured the rest of the sessions. Uh, Primarily, I think of this as an opportunity to get a thinking framework, right? It's not a policy brief. I won't be giving the right answer. I don't know what is the right answer. But there's a lot of models, a lot of frameworks that I tend to default on when advising our clients and counterparts. Um, and in all of that, I think one line that comes to mind is from George Box, and probably this being the CDPG, you've probably all heard of it, is that all models are wrong, but some are useful, right? So the same idea will apply here today. There's no framework that we'll build today that will perfectly capture where AI is going and its impacts and how we manage those things. But the idea is it's better to have an imperfect one rather than not having one, rather than falling flat-footed when the next wave of revolution sort of arrives, right? So that's sort of the context in this. And to a big disclaimer, you might not leave this presentation any wiser. You will definitely not have a lot of answers, but hopefully you will have some sharper questions, right? I mean, that's the angle with which I'm going at this. So please excuse me if you were looking for answers coming into the session. But before I dive in, I just also wanted to thank you, JD, the entire team at CDPG for organizing this and curating this. It's not easy, and you're truly walking the talk on building a public good by bringing people to talk about different issues, in addition to all of the good work that you're all doing. So thank you so much for having me, and thank you for creating this platform. So I'll jump straight into it right now. Let's dial back to 1950s because that is what you do. But if you think about, what a hard disk drive at that time used to look like, which was IBM's RAMAC, it was about a ton in weight and would store about 5 MB of data, right? Today, you can basically do that with a simple chip, which probably fits on your thumb and can hold up to 2 TB of data, right? That's about a 400 million times improvement on storage capacity in the last 70 years, right? So that's the scale of improvement that we're talking about. But the truth is, what we've seen in the last 5 to 6 years with the Gen AI revolution is far more impactful and far much more bigger than what I just described with the hard disk, right? So if you think about it, GPT-2 was released somewhere around 2019. It had about 1.5 billion parameters, right? GPT-4, about 4 years later from there, has about 1 trillion parameters, right? That's not linear, that's not exponential, that's actually a vertical cliff that you're looking at, right? So that's the scale of change that we've seen. And really that change has been brought about because of 5 things really coming together, right? There's, of course, cheaper hardware that has made it possible. Processing power has literally doubled for most of the last 70 years. Internet access is somewhat near universal. Model advances have happened. So all of these things happening simultaneously have actually created a compounding effect, which has led to these outcomes that we are seeing today. I know I'm sort of preaching to the choir here, but I'll just take a minute or two more to sort of delve a little bit into contextualizing what AI's impact has been and why is this moment so special, right? If you think about Gen AI, right, it fundamentally rewrites 3 assumptions that we had about computers and algorithms until 4 years ago, right? One was primarily that creativity is a right brain function and computers will never really be good at it. It is a function only meant for humans, whereas computers will get great and exceptionally great at left brain function. Gen AI has completely decimated that assumption, right? Now it can write better poems, it can draw much better, it can even design proteins and so on, whatnot, right? So the whole idea is Gen AI has broken the assumption that computers will only be good at left brain functions, but now they're also good at right brain functions and arguably in some ways better at right brain functions. The second assumption is that to be able to communicate with a computer, you need to be able to, know its language, right? So either you're using a GUI, menus, drop downs, and so on, or you need to know how to code. Both of those have been damaged, right? So now you basically are looking at a world where you can talk to your computer using plain English, or in some cases also other languages, right? So two-way communication has been made possible with just simple language. That's a big assumption that has been undone. And the third one is, and which sort of I don't think we talked about as much as a people or as a community, is that the Turing test has been slightly passed, right? So yes, you can still tell when an article or a LinkedIn post is written by Gen AI, but it's getting harder and harder as we speak, right? And it's doing a much better job. So that Turing test is no longer the sort of yardstick to cross for machines. It's already well past it. But really what captures the story for me is, and the real impact of Gen AI is, I think in about 2022 or so, there was an engineer from Google who basically claimed that Google's AI, Lambda, if I'm not wrong, has become sentient. Right now, at the time, this was, now, what is really, momentous about this situation is not that whether he's right or wrong, right? We can keep debating whether AI is sentient or not, whether Lambda is sentient or not, and so on. But the point that such a question can make global headlines, right? 10 years ago, that wouldn't have even been a question. Nobody would have published anything saying that Google search is sentient. The fact that we are entertaining that question today should give us a sense of where we are as a community, where we are as a people in the whole AI and technology revolution, right? I promise this is my last slide talking about technology to technologists, people who understand it far better than I do. But very briefly, this is something I couldn't resist myself from holding and putting on here. Is this fantastic explanation by Ben Evans on how technology moves, right? There's this understanding that technology is exponential. It sort of destroys that and says it's not exponential, it's definitely not linear, but it's actually a platform shift, right? Where you sort of for a decade or two move very quickly using a particular set of technologies and then make a step difference as you move on to the next one, right? So, and we've seen this forever, right? So mainframes, PCs, we went from, which enabled the whole WW World Wide Web sort of revolution to ended in the social media revolution. Then it went from app stores to the gig economies. And today we started with the JAP. So this is the shift about, the one that I'm talking about from Ben Evans' point of view. The whole idea here is technology sort of moves in platform shifts. It's not linear, it's not exponential, but it actually makes a step change every decade or so. And we are at that point today with Gen AI. And the reason I bring this up is really the crux of the talk today is, we regulated the car before the car became a car, but we sort of missed the bus when it comes to technology, algorithms, and so on, right? We've not really done enough about this. But really, this comes down to this idea that we're at a platform shift that we're seeing. If you think about it, right, Cambridge Analytica happened in the same year that the EU GDPR took effect, right? So both the negative impacts of technology arrived in the same year as the regulations did. So that gap where technology is sort of ahead of regulation is pretty real. And it's something that we should be very mindful of, right? Now, before I get into the challenges and how technology is sort of breaking apart the current governance ecosystem that we have, maybe a quick word about the benefits of technology, right? Is if you think about the economic benefits of technology, they're loud and clear to be seen, right? So the estimates by McKinsey and PwC say we're going to add anywhere between $13 to $15 trillion over the next 3 to 4 years into the economy. Geopolitically, it's enabled a lot of intelligence sharing between different countries. Democratically, you're looking at people in far-flung areas that are being detected with TB because now their X-rays, chest X-rays can actually be read by AI, and they don't need to actually have a doctor who's present in those premises, right? So in some ways, what AI has done is sort of, if I can be a bit ambitious about it, made disease and illiteracy optional, right? So AI has had tremendous amounts of positive impacts, and it will continue to do so. Essentially, right, we've also seen economic challenges because of AI, which is we are seeing enormous amounts of inequity that is being set in, right? And it's inequity not just in communities, but it's also inequity which is amongst countries, right? We can see these lock-in effects, and we'll talk a lot more about this in a second. There are geopolitical ramifications, right? For the longest time, oil was the big currency on which governments or geopolitics was defined. That sort of moved a little bit towards finance, and we're now seeing that's now moving towards technology very, very quickly, right? And then there are democratic and social impacts of technology as well, right? You're seeing AI-generated content, which is driving elections and so on and so forth. I'll just give you one example. I think it was an Eastern European country a couple of years back where an AI-generated audio of a particular party convincing people of how to rig votes went viral. It was AI generated. It was circulated 2 days before the polling, right? So it was too little time for anybody to respond, fact check, and do something about it. Lo and behold, the candidate obviously lost, right? So we are not anymore at a hypothetical situation where we're seeing technology actually have negative impacts, whether it is on economy, whether it is on geopolitics, or even on democracies as such, right? And this is really the moment that I want to talk about. Look, I'm an optimistic person. So talking about risks, I'm naturally allergic to it. But it would be sort of foolish not to look at it, right? And not just foolish, actually, dangerous not to get into the risks that AI potentially brings along with itself and things that need to be addressed as we go along, right? Now, I'll get into each of these in a second, but the point I wanted to make here was all of these feed into each other. So it's not like these are independent risks, right? These are problems which interact, and it's actually a systemic risk that we are actually looking at. So basically, I'll get into all these risks individually in a second, but the point I wanted to make here was they don't interact independently. They don't act independently, but actually interact with each other quite a bit, right? Let me give you a concrete example of this, right? So if you think about concentration of compute in, let's say, 2 or 3 hyperscalers, that's a sovereignty risk. But that concentration also means that the liability of AI harms, which is the moral and ethical risk, will diffuse across different layers, and no one regulator can fully own that risk, right? And then if you think about the concentration game capture, most of the productivity gains will be with a particular country because those hyperscalers sit there, so there's a distributive justice issue to it. The point is all these 3 risks are related, and you can't solve one without the other, right? But that said, let's just spend some time getting into the details of each of these risks, because the solutions, as I get to them, will sort of benefit from a deeper understanding of these risks, right? The first one is the socio-economic risk. I talked about a little bit of this when it came to elections. There's distributive justice that I also talked about, how different communities and different countries can start owning less or more. But then there's economic and job losses, right? IISc, where CPDG is based out of, is in Bangalore, right? And I think one of the cities in India that is already starting to feel the burn and the pinch of AI impact on job losses is Bangalore, where we're starting to see massive amounts of job layoffs happening in IT companies, where AI seems to be helping these countries get a lot more efficient. The point really being in all of this is, I think, and I'm happy to go into more details as we get into questions on this. I think the assumption that, these job losses, somehow technology never results in net job losses because new jobs are created, is a faulty one, right? And we're already starting to see this, and there are many reasons for this. The pace at which the change is happening, the structural difference in between the jobs that will be created and the jobs that are lost, and the fact that it's not a one-to-one job creation, it's actually much lesser than that. So there are quite a few factors, but the job losses and the economic impacts of all of this is pretty real, right? The second risk is around, this whole idea of AI sovereignty. And, there's a very standard model to look at it. You can look at data, you can look at compute, you can look at the models and applications. I'll just spend time on one or two of these to just sort of expand a little bit more. Let's talk about data, since we're talking with the Center for Public Data and for Public Goods. The funny thing, or the strange thing, depending on how you look at it, is big data is today, sort of concentrated in a few companies. Whether it is search, social, or enterprise data, it's deeply capitalized by just a few companies. Now, that is a certain amount of barrier for other companies to come and catch up. But the barrier has become even more harder, because if you think about it, search, social, or enterprise, all three of those areas actually are now being flooded with a lot of synthetic AI data, which is not of as much value as much as the earlier data, which was purely human developed, right? So there's a lock-in effect that has been created, where these companies which actually hold that big data have created an edge for themselves, which is going to be very, very hard for other companies and countries to beat. Similarly, when it comes to compute, there's literally one firm today which controls majority of the chips market. There are 3 or 4 firms which control the entire cloud market. So these create choke points which countries or companies have to go through, and really don't have much of an option. The same can be said about models. The same can be said about applications, right? So there's a major risk which is coming in terms of who controls that AI infrastructure. The third one is really around frontier models, right? And how that is starting to generate accountability gaps across the entire chain, right? What I've done here is looked at this value chain from in the reverse, so where the harm occurs, to all the way to the regulator. And you can see there are multiple gaps here. But let me share a very interesting story from New York, right? A couple of years ago. There was a New York lawyer who submitted a legal briefing, and he cited 6 precedents in support of his case, right? Now, the opposing counsel noticed something very odd about these citations. When he actually looked them up, he realized all of these did not exist. These were all ChatGPT hallucinations, completely fabricated, which had very real life, realistic sounding quotes from judges, right? Now, the lawyer was sanctioned, and the case went where it had to. But there is a very critical governance question all of this raises, right? Who exactly was really liable in all of this? You can argue that, yes, it was the lawyer, because the lawyer was the one who was supposed to do the due diligence on it. But also, shouldn't the AI company that actually gave him all those hallucinations have warned him about what it's serving, and the fact that this should not be used in a court of law? Shouldn't the courts have a procedure for AI-generated filings? And if the error had gone undetected, would the opposing counsel also be held liable because he let those fictitious citations to pass through? So really, really important questions that we really don't have answers to. This is also very true for the whole driverless car situation, where that trolley problem has become real, right? So what we're seeing is we genuinely don't have an answer to where the liability actually lies. The jurisdiction rules are not clear. And in effect, actually, as these things get more and more complicated, today we are talking about legal issues and so on, where there is a response time, where it is happening in a controlled environment. But just imagine what happens when this bleeds into healthcare, into criminal justice, where people are actually, given the death sentences and so on and so forth. So there is a lot that needs to be thought through when it comes to liabilities. Now, as I said, I have an allergy to risk, so I'll pause the conversation on risks now and turn my gaze towards the solutions as they exist, and also what needs to come in. Right? What you see on your screen right now here is the standard response that governments have broadly come up with. Right? So if you take a step back, governments really just have 2 levers to respond to the whole technology revolution. One is to control financing. How much money do you put in, right? Or how much do you tax and penalize firms, right? So you can play with the financial lever. Or the second one is the regulatory lever, is you can come up with laws which basically, or regulations that force companies to get clearances before they can go to market, versus it being a laissez-faire model where companies can essentially do whatever they want to do, and the government comes in after the fact. Depending on that, it sort of gives you a archetypical sort of 4 archetypes of responses that exist. The first one is where you have reasonable amount of financing and a reasonable amount of regulation, which is sort of the walled green, as I call it. It's a very rights-oriented but precautionary approach. It is what the EU AI Act does, right? It creates these very strong, stringent responses or requirements for risks that need to be evaluated before models go to market, and at the same time, backs it up with some amount of funding. On the other end, if you look at fast movers, you're looking at the American model of sorts, where essentially the government is throwing tremendous amount of money, and on regulation, it's sort of leaning towards very low friction, right? So letting companies innovate and then responding to it after. India, if you ask me, I think sits somewhere comfortably in between the 4, and the rest of the world really sits in that bracket of explorers where they're sort of waiting to figure out how to regulate, they're waiting to figure out how to sort of put financing or how much financing to put in. I think what's important here is to appreciate that one response is not necessarily better than the other, right? It's not a value judgment. But the story there is really, if you think about the 2008 crisis, right, where the whole financial system was unraveled, the world sort of split into 2 camps, right? The US response was interventionist, but very, very finance friendly. So there were stress tests, there were capital requirements, but no really breaking up of the big banks, right? So that's one response, which is still very similar to how the US is looking at AI. And the EU went on the other end, which was sort of, let's increase accountability, let's look at consumer rights, even though it will cost us some amount of market value, right? And the UK sort of took a split the difference kind of approach where it was in between. 15 years later, it sort of seems like, both those models or all 3 of those models sort of work okay. One doesn't necessarily work better than the other. So really the point I want to make here, the first point I wanted to make here was, it isn't a value judgment. One model is not better than the other, but it's a reflection of the values of the ecosystem that you're in, or the country that you're in. But the second and sort of more sharp remark that I wanted to make, these are 20th century responses to a 21st century problem. These are responses that we use. These are the same 2 levers we use for the financial crisis, and these are the same levers that we've used 100 years ago as well, when the world wars were happening. The point being that really our responses have to be very, very different for this 21st century problem of AI that we're facing. And here's my attempt to try and give it some color and try to give it some sort of an answer, is fixing this governance will require 3 big areas or 3 big principles to be incorporated or embedded in what we do, right? The first is agility, and I mean this in every sense of the term, right? It has to be proactive governance, right? You can't wait for things to happen before you sort of respond. It has to be adaptive. Once things have happened, you need to study the response, study why it happened the way it happened, and then come back with a way to sort of deal with it. And then final is, it needs to also have a bias for action, right? Is you cannot hold yourself, you cannot stop from doing something, but you need to keep moving continuously. So that's first principle that needs to be there in whatever response that governments come up with. The second area is multilateralism, right? Where the tendency of a lot of countries right now is to look inwards. And I'll get into more of this as to why countries are starting to contest and compete on AI, where actually they must be collaborating and coordinating. But that tendency needs to go away, right? Where we need to break that inward-looking approach that we tend to typically take in these situations. And the final one, which is probably the most important of all, is have inclusion at the top of the list at every point of the journey. And it's at all levels. It is at an individual level, it is at a community level, it's also at the global south level. The point is, we need to actually go beyond the maxim of no one left behind to actually everyone left better, right? That's the world that we should aspire to. Those are the principles that we need to keep in mind. Now, all of this might sound like high speak and principles that are hard to achieve, but the truth is we as a people have been successful in the past in achieving these things and embedding them into our governance. Let me give you one example, right? If you recall the Montreal Protocol about late 80s, it asked sovereign nations to sort of constrain their own industrial activity, right? For the benefit of people who are not yet even born. So they're not voters right now, they're voters in the future, and ecosystems without any political constituencies, right? Now, that is something that the world came together to do, is create a Montreal Protocol, and it has worked, right? The ozone layer is measurably recovering. And if you ask what really made it work, it's really these three principles are in action, right? There was a shared scientific body that nations trusted. There was a mechanism that was there to update commitments, so there was agility, and there were financial transfers to those developing nations. So compliance didn't just become a tax on the poor, so there was inclusion. All these three principles were in action in the late 1980s. But if you think about AI governance today, all those three are missing. There is no shared scientific body with real authority. Our frameworks are largely static. You hear the same thing being regurgitated by different think tanks. And the global south is almost universally becoming a rule taker rather than a rule maker, right? Uh, and so if you want AI governance to work, it really needs to remimic what the Montreal Protocol did for the digital age. And now let me just give you two very sharp examples of how this can be done before I open it up for any questions. Uh, uh, and really here is, the first one is around AI sovereignty, right? I think it's a fallacy to think of sovereignty AI sovereignty in terms of geopolitical sovereignty. Geopolitical sovereignty is born from ownership over land. Technology is not land, it's not the same physical asset. And therefore, what we should be looking at is sovereignty that cuts across and has different levels. So not just being contesting and competing at the bottom of that ladder, but thinking about collaboration and cooperation, which is at the top of that ladder. And we've scaled this, right? I just gave you the example of the Montreal Protocol. We did this with the Bretton Woods institutions where we are cooperating and collaborating with the UNs and the World Banks. The other point I just wanted to quickly also make here was these 5 Cs that I've laid out might look different for different countries, but also look different for the same country across the different AI value chain. So you might choose to compete on data, but you might choose to collaborate or cooperate on models and applications, right? So countries need to, rather than finding a one size fits all, this is a US versus China question, who do we align with, have to come up with a far more nuanced view of how to do this. And what I've put out here are a few examples of when we've done this globally, geopolitically, but also examples of when we've done this in the technology sphere. The TCP/IP protocol, which is behind literally everything that is connecting us on the internet, was something where all of us collaborated and came together, right? And so on and so forth, right? So there are different ways in which we've done this, and we need to come up with a map for each country on how it sort of thinks about its AI sovereignty, different from geopolitical sovereignty. The last example on a solution that I wanted to give, and I've used Donald Rumsfeld matrix of the known knowns and the unknown unknowns, is really this idea of rather than thinking about risks in one bucket, which is the cheerleaders that AI will solve everything for us, to cheerleaders would say, or the doomsayers which will say AI is going to take us all over and we are going to become slaves to AI, to actually have a more nuanced view which has a bias for action, right? Looking at risks in different categories. What are the known knowns, right? What are those risks that we know that will happen, and how can we sort of address them? So there the idea is pre-deployment checks, having no-go, no-go criteria before you deploy models. Then there are the known unknowns, right? Risks that we know in principle, but we don't exactly know how they're going to come out, right? So deceptive behavior of LLMs and so on. Now, again, here SOPs, which are very, very quick to react, control the damage and fix the damage, right? Then there are issues of willful ignorance, right? Where, yes, this is one of the most critical and politically charged one, where industry actually knows technology is doing harm. We've seen this happen in the case of a social media company, which withheld report about addiction and loneliness that is caused by social media platforms, only for it to be discovered in legal battles, right? Now, how do we sort of have mandatory filings, audits, whistleblower protections to be able to tackle those. And then there are the unknown unknowns, right? The risks that we cannot anticipate, but are outside our current frame. So how do you sort of come up with structured foresight exercises, platforms like these where you can talk about these issues, right? So there are, so the whole idea here is rather than thinking about risks in one bucket, break them down and in a way that you're able to create a bias for action where you're able to sort of act on things and then also know how to act when those risks actually become a reality. I'll pause there, but I just wanted to leave all of you with a quote from John F. Kennedy. It is the time to repair the roof is when the sun is shining. Kennedy said this about the budget in 1962, but it's becoming something of a universal governance norm today, where you build resilience not during crisis, but before it. And right now, we're standing in sunshine when it comes to AI. It's delivering real benefits, Edison, education, productivity. The public and political attention is also pretty high. And there's a window which is open for serious governance work. But these windows close. They closed before on social media when the Cambridge Analytica scandal broke out. They closed on the financial regulations after 2008. So my point really in all of what I've said today is really this, is we must use this moment. And whoever you are in this room, whether you're a policymaker, a technologist, researcher, or a citizen, the time to repair the roof is now. Let me pause there. I'll turn it back to you, JD, for any questions.
Thanks, thanks, Vivek. I believe you have hit the right notes, and I think it's high time for these kinds of deliberations, these kinds of dialogues and arguments, counter arguments. I think we should pause and ponder, because as you rightly pointed out, the rate at which these changes are happening is something more than disruption. So very well put. So I'll now open the session to any of the listeners who would like to have some questions. Please unmute yourself and raise your question. Yeah, maybe you can raise your hand and we can facilitate that. Yeah, thanks, Rajendra. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi, Rekha.
Yes,
Am I audible?
Yes,
Hi.
yes, please
Hi,
go
great
ahead.
presentation. Yes, great presentation. Thank you. So I mean, just a thought. So given that most of the
Rekha, could
regulation
you
that
briefly introduce yourself? Could you
oh
briefly
yes,
introduce yourself a
uh,
bit? Yeah, a bit.
perfect. Hi, I am Rekha. I work in IAC and ISAC Center for Public Health as a postdoctoral researcher, and I'm an economist who works on health. So yeah, like started calling myself as a health economist. Uh, yes, that's about me. So, I mean, so the presentation was extremely interesting for me as it is very closely linked to like what I know, like in the whole spectrum of AI. And yes, coming back to the question. So, given like we talk about regulation, which often reacts to harm, as in the case like Montreal Protocol that you mentioned, so do you think there is a case for anticipatory governance in AI where we can have, say, a central authority who is informed in advance about, say, the scope as well as the potential of the societal impact of these technologies before they are being widespread deployed to the society? So, do you think this could help in reducing the black box risk of what can happen and allow regulation to precede harm rather than follow the harm?
So
It's just my
fantastic
thought.
question. No. I think it's very interesting. So I'll say a few things on that, right? So number one is sort of if I take AI out of the picture for a second, right? If you think about regulations, laws, and policies, they always are following on what has actually happened, right? So it's almost like Hindi movies mein after
Reaction.
things are done, the police comes after everything is done, right? So it's sort of representative how government, and it's not a reflection of India or anything. It's a global phenomena where governments, laws, and regulations are reactive, right? So what they wait for is first a certain amount of social consensus to be formed, after which a legal consensus on something is formed, right? However, in certain things, there is, especially on areas where the harm can be extreme, government has to engineer laws much before those harms set in, right? And I think that's your point, Rekha, is exactly that, is the AI is one of those things where we need to have a sense of how we're going to regulate it, how we're going to respond to it before the fact, right? Because there is a certain amount of permanence, right, that AI infrastructure calcifies. I talked about TCP/IP as a success story very briefly. The truth is, if we were to change it today, it's going to be very, very hard. So if somehow magically we found out that there's something wrong about it, it doesn't agree with certain principles of human nature, and every country can agree to it, but even changing that, despite that agreement, would be very, very difficult. So therefore, in the case of AI and technology, I think it's better to sort of look at it from ahead of time rather than look at it in rear view, right? So that's the point. Now, where I think I might slightly disagree is a individual body might not be the answer, right? A individual regulation is also not the answer. I think we are at really a point where we need to design institutions and design approaches which are sort of unseen in the past, right? I said somewhat provocatively during my presentation, these are 20th century responses to a 21st century problem.
Exactly.
What we need is some sort of a more agile ecosystem where industry and government are working together hand in hand. And if I can be a bit ambitious about it, we're starting to see those models come up. If you think about DigiYatras of the world and the Covins of the world, these were not created purely by governments or purely by private players, right? These are concoctions where different players and actors have come together in sort of very, very slightly unimaginable ways. 20 years ago, if you thought that government would have such sort of a partnership, that would seem very, very difficult. Or 20 years ago, if you thought that government would create a technology platform that private sector will then come and exploit in not necessarily a bad way, in a positive way, it would have all seemed very, very difficult to understand. So I think the solution is, you're right, that it has to be preemptive, but it will probably take a form which is hard to describe right now, but one that will bring many different actors together and use tools and levers that we've probably not used before. And I'll give you one example. And actually, just as I was starting the presentation, a news flash had come in that Donald Trump, the president of the United States, has basically said he's in support of the kill switch for AI, right? So I haven't read the details of it, but it's quite interesting, right? So this discussion that we're having right now is very, very live and is being had at the highest levels in the government.
Wow. Thank you so much. Just want to add one more thing to it, like as a question maybe. So do you think the fine line between like what we call as government and what we call as industry or the common people are gonna like fade away? Because as you said, like, I mean, I don't know who decides like, decisions anymore. You don't know what is actual, what is real, and what is not real anymore. So do you think like that's gonna like fade away over the time? I mean,
So I think
it's a
that
very anarchist question. Yes.
no, I mean, I won't classify it as anarchist, to be honest with you. I think it's evolutionary, right? Let me take a couple of examples from the US itself, right? At some point, President Trump again had floated the idea of shareholding in tech firms, right? Where the government actually has a share in these tech firms, completely unheard of. You saw Elon Musk come into the government, right? A private sector player come into the government and try to bring private sector approaches into the government. So, I think this is what you're seeing here is beyond individuals, right? It's easy to sort of just say, okay, it's certain individuals doing certain things. I think these are indicators of the direction in which polity is moving. They might not be perfect responses to the challenge at hand, but they are indicative of where the responses are going, right? So I think the border between public and private is blurring. The speed at which technology is moving, to expect that bureaucracy or elected representatives in any country, for that matter, have a deep understanding of how it moves and how it flows, I think is unfair, right? So there is that challenge which is definitely going to be there.
So
and
yeah, maybe Vivek will take some other questions.
Please.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks for the question, Aki. Yeah. So
Thank you so much.
we have
I'm so sorry for taking
No. That's okay, Rekha. Thank you. So we have another question from one Mr. Vijay. He said that there's some of your thoughts maybe it appears to be a bit abstract to comprehend for many of us. Any thoughts on how schooling might evolve with Gen AI and how law practice might evolve? What are your thoughts, Vivek, on these? How AI is
So
going to impact, like, school education and law as a profession? Yeah.
now, thank you so much, JD and Vijay, for that. I think let me start with law, right? And I'll give you actual concrete examples of what is happening right now rather than be abstract. Um, in Estonia, in China, and in Singapore, you have AI judges, where judges are basically an AI algorithm and are pronouncing judgments for petty crimes where the fine is below 5,000 euros in the case of Estonia, in China broadly on petty crimes where the crime, the penalty could be anything. In case of Singapore, it's an arbitration. You have AI judges which are pronouncing judgments, right? So we've gotten to that point today on law in some of these countries. I believe that this will continue to increase and expand a lot more, right? I don't think, at least as of now, from what I understand of technology, that there will be no more human judges. I think there's a case for a human in the loop to still remain, but you will start seeing a lot of petty cases, a lot of simple cases, which are standard clearances getting cleared by AI. For instance, if one of the biggest set of cases in the US is tickets, right? Traffic tickets, violation tickets that people get. Now, a lot of these things can immediately be cleared off just by looking at traffic imagery and so on and so forth. There's no reason why AI can't actually do that, right? So we're looking at, I think, the legal profession change profoundly, and hopefully the backlog in cases also gets limited significantly, right? So this is a live example of where AI is being used by judges, by countries to actually pronounce judgments. I think that will only increase with time. When it comes to education as well, I think there are clear examples that have emerged. There's personalized tutoring, which is starting to happen, where online education platforms are able to understand how a student learns, where the gaps are, and then be able to question them on them and teach them accordingly, right? So this is also happening as we speak today, where AI is being used, technology is being used to actually improve education. Now, let's take a step back and say, why is that important in education? The biggest challenge in education has been that it is a brick and mortar expansion, right? You need to have schools, you need to have good teachers in those schools, right? So that has been the biggest constraint. But now if you have AI, which can replicate a lot of what good teachers do, is actually make a connection with the student, see where their gaps are, train them and talk to them in a language that they understand and appreciate. If AI is able to do that well, you're able to get quality education to absolutely anyone and everyone who has access to a laptop and an internet connection. So this has started to happen. Again, it hasn't scaled. There are obviously other things to be considered here before it starts scaling significantly. But I think these are two trends that we will see, and there are also a lot of other things which are happening at fringes in law. We are starting to see legal firms start to use AI for case research and so on and so forth. In education, there are other use cases as well that are being championed with all of this. But these are two real use cases which I think will have transformative impact on people.
Thanks, Vivek. I believe Vijay, you had your answer. Are there any questions from the audience, the participants, rather? So I have a couple of questions, Vivek, but maybe time may not permit us to discuss them in detail. But I just wanted to understand one thing, India has had its own share of success building these digital public infrastructures, right? Since we work in that domain, I wanted to understand, like, we have this India stack, and all of these DPIs, if you see, are sort of I would say not intelligent, right? I mean, they are like UPIs of the world, GSTI and Digiyatras and all that. And some of these we have taken to the world, like Aadhaar goes in the form of MOSIP. UPI also has been exported. Uh, I mean, do you think that there there are two parts of my question. One is that do you think there can be something like DPI plus plus, where India can lead the world in adding a layer of intelligence on these existing DPI infrastructures? Uh, that is first question, right? And secondly, can India lead, in taking these kind of AI solutions at scale? Because of course we have limitations of compute, we have limitations. We don't have a sovereign model. Like we have a couple of them, but not like something which is global. But do you think that we still have chance, or has we already missed the bus? So these are two questions I have for you.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't think we've missed the bus, right? The challenge and the competition is pretty high. But I think there are two things that are very, very important here to note. One is GenAI is great, but this is infancy right now, right? I mean, there is so much more of development that can be done when it comes to GenAI, right? For instance, right now, I don't know if people have noticed in the last 2 weeks, Claude has started to not be as good as it used to be. And the problem is very simple, is because a lot of times it learns from its own responses, so it starts becoming more and more synthetic over time. It's a problem that ChatGPT faced 2 years ago, right? But they've still not been able to fix it. So I think the point is these models will continue to evolve. And they're, they're, and the actually the DeepSeek moment is a very special one to look at, right? If you think about DeepSeek, it is not really a result of the Chinese government doing something really, really special for them. It's a result of a few very smart people getting together who happen to be in China and developing a model that actually does so well. The point is, there is the opportunity to do good stuff and really, really breakthrough stuff is still there, because there are unsolved problems and it doesn't take too much. I'm oversimplifying, but I think, and I'm being a bit optimistic about it, but it doesn't take too much, right? So in that sense, I think India has an opportunity to still cover a lot of distance in the models race. In the data race, I think we're far ahead and will continue to be far ahead, right? I mean, the amount of data that we generate as 1.4 billion people, and with a lot of them not on GenAI right now, I think we still have, if we're able to sort of organize ourselves a little better, we'll be able to have a big strength there. Applications, we've done pretty well. In fact, our DPI infrastructure is built for application layer, right? In some ways, if you think about this model that has come out, India had sort of thought about it inadvertently with its old DPI infrastructure. So I think of the four things, which is data, compute, models, and applications, India has a very strong leg in three of those, right? So there's one, yes, which is on compute, which is a little harder to catch up because there are technological barriers, right? You don't have the technology to do it. It's not so easy to replicate. And there are also supply chain barriers on, sourcing the right material to do it. And that I think is going to hold true for most of the world, right? Except probably for the US and the China. So there again, I think India can do certain things very, very well, where it can create, let's say, a consortium of rare earth metals with some countries in the region, where then, they start having a say in how that entire compute conversation moves. So there are moves that India can make, and it's actually already making. Yeah.
So you mentioned that global south is essentially a rule taker and right, and like so I mean, do you think India or the global south as a whole can leapfrog, to catch up, or like what is your suggestion, like for maybe units like us, like what should we do differently to be state of the art, to compete with the best across the globe? I mean, we are doing some things which are, as per global standards, right? But what do you think? How do we make that mark and move from from that mindset of a rule taker to a rule maker? That's my last question. Yeah.
But that's the hardest one. I thought I'd end on a high. No, I'm kidding. No, so I think so. There are two logics here, right? The first logic is, if the global south is left behind too far, it is actually detrimental to the whole AI ecosystem, right? A, because it generates tremendous amount of data. So it sort of is important, and it's a consumer of those models, right? So the first thing is, I think it's going to be it's detrimental to these companies, to these countries, to sort of leave the global south behind on all of this, right? So to that extent, I think global south needs to understand that they're coming with some leverage to the table. The second thing I think that is also important here is it's not so much about competing with the world. It is not so much about coming in the top 5 or top 10, as much as it is about using technology in a way that it does good for those countries themselves, right? So how do we sort of focus on turning all of this into what does good for India, what does good for country X, right? So changing the lens on that, I think the global competition will come, and it'll come later. Like if you think about Aadhaar, when we created the whole India stack, we were not thinking about what the world wants to say about it and how would it distinguish us globally. We were thinking about a real problem that we were trying to solve about increasing banking access to the unbanked in India, and then built something really, really good that eventually had the impact of us becoming a world leader. I think we should channel that same mentality again. We're not building for the world right now. It will happen as things happen when you do something really good, but focus on what is really required for India right now to sort of realize its own potential, to realize its own economic potential and social potential.
Yeah. Thanks for your answer, Vivek. Yeah. So, any other questions, Namrata? Anything from your end?
No, JD.
All right. Okay. In that case, maybe we can close the session. Thanks once again, Vivek. Thanks for your time. And I think these are really, we're very happy to, hear your global perspectives. That is very much needed actually. Yeah. So essentially we have to build for India, but at the same time we cannot, we cannot be very short-sighted of doing something sort of locally. We have to contribute to the new world order, so to say, right? And AI is of course one aspect of that, but as you mentioned about the rare earth metals, and I just saw back there was a big conference here, and I figured out that how important it is. So maybe we get a bit obsessed with AI kind of things, but there are other things also, right, where we can lead. So yeah, I mean, thanks for these perspectives. They are very fresh. Many times we all think in a very similar way, like in a tech way, but we forget that policy is what should drive that technology as well. So thank you once again. Thanks for your time. And whenever you are in Bangalore, just have some time and visit us at ISC campus. Thank you.
I'll absolutely do that. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.